Thank you so much for your very kind welcome, and it's always a treat to come at Policy Exchange. I decided not to come more than once every 10 years to make it, you know, a real event, because when you see too much of me, you're going to get bored.
This and that.
This and that, exactly. Unfortunately, there's a sort of macabre topicality in the fact that this book comes out in its English translation right at the time when there is the Manchester attack. And it's not the first time that happened in the history of that book. It was published in French a few days after the Bataclan attacks. And because of that, probably it sort of became a central stage and was heavily discussed in France. The book is, in English, was updated and also revised so that people who are not necessarily familiar with everything French can read it easily. And so it's updated until the Breitscheidplatz attack in Berlin that took place in December of last year, 19th of December last year. And it's about France. France be seen as a paradigm, if you wish. A paradigm that many in the rest of Europe thought was irrelevant to their own countries. From Germany and from Britain, we heard a number of voices saying that, you know, after all, if the French had 239 dead, it was their fault. They were the culprits because there were a bunch of Islamophobes, because they were secularists, and so on and so forth. And then there was a praise for other systems that sort of give a greater place to religion, that dealt with the Muslim brothers happily, and so on and so forth, and that, you know, was to be the solution. That preventing extremism meant working with the community, and the fact that the French were perceived as not working enough with the community had a consequence, and that consequence was terrorism. Of course, this kind of Weltanschauung is more difficult to sell those days, because whereas the attacks in France were foiled over the last 8 months, and we had to suffer no attack, or no attack was completed. Many of them were foiled or nipped in the bud, and we'll get to understand why a little later. Since the stabbing of Father Jacques Hamel in his church in Normandy on the 26th of July 2016, we saw a number of attacks in Germany, culminating in the Breitscheidplatz mad lorry thing, which was a reenactment of the Nice Bastille Day attack on the 14th of July, with this very careful design by ISIS, even though, as I shall try to show, it's a sort of bottom-up, network-based system and not a top-down organization. The lorry in Nice was white. It was a huge white lorry, and the lorry in Berlin was black, entirely black. And black and white, as is present on the book cover, is the flight of ISIS. And, you know, the media dimension, the propaganda dimension of such operations are extremely important, because they catch the attention of the masses that those guys want to mobilize, and are a display of strength, or supposedly it was an attempt at a display of strength. Now, the fact that we had attacks in Germany, and that we had the Westminster attack 2 months ago, just right here, and then the Manchester attack last week, or this week, shows that France is not the only target. And on the contrary, I believe that the reason why, as of now, and there is no wood here, but touch wood, I would say, I would pretend this is wood, touch plastic. was to some extent spared, I think shows that in a way, the sort of intelligence model that has developed after a lot of trial and error in France makes it again a country which is more difficult to strike at, as had been the case in the past between 1995 and 2012, when you had bombs in Spain, you had on the 11th of March 2004, we had 7/7/2005 in this city, then the stabbing of Theo van Gogh in the Netherlands, and so on and so forth. Whereas, in spite of the fact that we have the biggest Muslim population in Europe, and I do not say, of course, that Muslims are interested in jihad, all of them, on the contrary, most of them just loathe and hate the jihadists, but from a jihadist point of view, this was a big pond in which to fish, if I may say so. During those 16 years, they would not attack the French territory because they were almost sure to be discovered. And this is to some extent what we have seen over the last 8 months. Something which had a very important consequences on the French political scene, because pundits had all prophesied that Marine Le Pen would make a landslide, and that she would be between 30 and 40% of the votes in the first round of the election, that she may be defeated in the runoff, but at a very small margin, and that then she would be in a capacity to have a blocking minority in the parliamentary elections, which are taking place next, more or less coincidentally with your parliamentary elections, 11th and 18th of June, which did not happen, as you know, and Emmanuel Macron trounced her very significantly in the second round. The Front National is in heavy crisis now, and internal crisis. They will have significant difficulties for the parliamentary elections. And during the final debate, a few days before the runoff, she attacked him on the issues that he was soft on terrorism. And he answers, and this was a line I had given to him, and he quoted me to that effect, that actually the jihadists wanted the extreme right to be elected, because in doing so, in their view, this was a key issue for their propaganda machine. What they say to their co-religionists is the following: the more we attack, the more there is retaliation. Retaliation will lump together all Muslims. They will have people desecrating mosques, making Islamophobic attacks, and so on and so forth. And this will show you that you have no future as integrated parts of the European societies, that you have to cling to your own ascribed identity and constituency, and that you have to make a difference between the real, true Sharia-abiding Muslims on the one hand, and the bad Muslims, the apostates, who are integrated into European societies and whose blood is licit, damum halal, as they say in Arabic, and the rest of the society, which is made out of kuffar, of apostates, whose blood is also licit. And shunning the traditional understanding of the world in the Muslim doctrine, Islamic doctrine, which makes of Christians, of Jews, and eventually even made of Hindus, when Islam came to India, people of the book, i.e. people with whom we socialize, to whom we do not allow proselytism, but with whom we socialize and whose existence is accepted. So this shift is very important. And therefore, in this view, the more the jihadists are able to weigh on the institutionalized political agenda, the better for their own sake and for what they have in mind, which is mobilizing their co-religionists under their banner. And this is where the heart of the battle lies, right? Because it is not difficult to kill people. It is not difficult to kill teenagers at a concert in Manchester, even though there are security measures, which this is also a difference between the French and the British dimension. France is under a state of emergency, and the heavy security pressure in France, to some extent, has helped to foil a number of attacks. And also the fact that we had this sort of Jacobin state, which is derided in many places, in such circumstances helps definitely, when on the other hand you have 16 Länder, each with its own CT apparatus, which does not completely cooperate with the other. It takes some time. Or when you have 43 police institutions, as is the case in the UK. Now, this issue of translating murders into proselytizing and breaking society, this is of essence. This is the key issue. If we look at it from a global political dimension, which raises questions on CT, as they say in America, and CVE, countering violent extremism and counterterrorism. And you know, these are two ways of dealing with this issue. One considers the CVE approach, which was President Obama's approach, who never used the word jihadist during his tenure, even after Orlando. Considers that this is mainly an issue of disenfranchisement, and that you do not have to take ideology into account. This is something which is very popular here, and which in France is represented by my former colleague Olivier Roy, known as Oli Roy, over the channel. On the other hand, there is the pure CT approach that does not take into consideration the social dimension. There's a disenfranchisement issue, the absentee father problem, and that focuses only on, you know, sort of ideological and security dimension, which I think is also a failure if it is used exclusively. A sound policy should be something that has a mix of the two, but with, I believe, CT in the leading position, not CVE. Because CVE does not grasp the global dimension of the issue. It has to be implemented, but as a means, not as an end.
Can you just explain what CVE, the term?
Countering violent extremism, which I just said, and which to a large extent means farming out to the community the policing of that very community. Now, why not? But you have to be conscious that there is a political price to pay. If you farm out to the Muslim Brothers the policing of the community, then they will ask for something in compensation. Are you ready to pay for it, or are you not ready to pay for it? Where does the balance lie? And this is also something which I believe is a very important issue, which has not really been discussed, and we can go on at length during the Q&A session on that. Now, very briefly, and because I have 5 minutes left, let me give you in a nutshell what the book is about. I've tried with this book to put the violence of the 239 dead in France, but you also, in my view, can put the German example and the British example into this global frame, that modern-day jihadism has undergone 3 stages or 3 phases. The first one, from 1979 to 1997, started in Afghanistan, and the two godmothers, or the godmother and the godfather of this jihad, was America on the one hand and Saudi Arabia on the other. The aim of the game was to oust the Soviets from Afghanistan after the Red Army had invaded the country on Christmas Day in 1979, which was the main American issue after Vietnam, when they didn't find many volunteers to send boys from Oklahoma or Kansas to the stands, as they say. And also for the Saudis, on top of pleasing Uncle Sam, the issue was to have a counter-fire against the proletizing of the Iranians. Khomeini had taken over in Iran in February of that year, and they were panic-stricken at the idea that they would be ousted because the tidal wave that the Iranian Revolution had wanted to start all over the Muslim world. 10 years later, it worked. On the 15th of February, 1989, the Red Army pulled out from Afghanistan, leading to 11/9, not to 9/11, that is, say, the fall of the Berlin Wall a few months later. And Khomeini had to use the Rushdie affair to try to pull the carpet under the feet of the Sunni jihadists so that they would not become, with their Saudi and American sponsors, the heralds and champions of the Muslim world. And the Rushdie affair took place on Valentine's Day, the very day before the Soviet pullout, on purpose, and a month after the Bradford book burning, as you remember. Then foreign fighters, or jihadists, as we coined them at the time to make a difference with the mujahideen, who were the local fighters, went back to their country of origin and tried to duplicate the Afghan jihad there, except that they had no stingers and no Saudi money. And in Algeria and in Egypt, for instance, it did not work out. And it did not work out. And in 1997, the jihadi groups were defeated. And there were lessons to be learned from that. The ones who draw the lessons were Al-Qaeda people, Bin Laden and Zawahiri. And then we get into second phase of jihadism. They try to think, why is it didn't work? It didn't work because the masses did not mobilize under the banner of the jihadists. And in order to do that, you had to change the focus and change the strategy. Bin Laden and Zawahiri thought that the reason it had failed was because it was a fight against the nearby enemy, al-adu al-qarib in Arabic, the local despots, the local apostate regimes, the Algerian regime, the Egyptian regime, so on and so forth. And the Muslim masses were frightened to mobilize because they knew that the West was behind, that the West was mighty, and that it was to destroy them. Therefore, Bin Laden and Zawahiri said, you have to focus on the faraway enemy, i.e. America. And this will expose the West as a colossus with feet of clay, and therefore the masses will not be afraid anymore and will mobilize. That was implemented immediately with the attacks on the American embassies in 1998 in Kenya and Tanzania, and then the Cole affair in 2000, the USS Cole in Aden, and then 9/11. 9/11 was an event of an enormous magnitude, and it sort of hijacked the TV viewers at the time, because we have to remember that this phase 2 of jihadism was the satellite television phase, where you had to focus on TV viewers. People watched TV at the time. And whereas the first phase was the fax machine phase, which belongs to the museums of prehistory. Nowadays, as you'll see, we're not in the same phase anymore. It's not a TV issue, it's a social networks issue. It was spectacular. It was maybe the beginning of the new era, and to some extent, 9/11 was the answer to 11/9. 11/9, the fall of the Berlin Wall, 9/11, the attack, and to some extent for Americans who thought they could have used those so-called freedom fighters with beards to topple, to give the last blow to the Soviet Empire. It was to some extent as if I may say so, their halal chicken had come home to roost, right? And this was something which, of course, was difficult to think in America, but that would have meant that you would have to rethink what it was to farm out to jihadists the last gasp of the Soviet Union. Something that we may try to also integrate in our thinking for those who want to farm out to the Muslim Brothers the policing of the community. Because the price can be paid, a little later, of course, with installments. And so this had failed, because the second phase also failed, because the Zawahiri and the others thought that, the West would send their troops to Afghanistan. They would be defeated in Afghanistan, just like the Soviet had been defeated, and that would be the beginning of the end. The neocons, out of malice or out of wickedness, sent their troops mainly to Iraq. And in Iraq, they passed this strange alliance with their nemesis, the Iranian Republic, farmed out, actually, Iraq to the Iranians, except for the Sunnis, who were defeated. Al-Qaeda was defeated in Iraq, but retracted and concentrated on the Sunni part of Iraq, the minority Sunni Arab part of Iraq, which would lead to ISIS in the present phase. So another failure in mobilizing the masses. This is when we enter into the third and present day phase. That starts, I would say, in January 2005, when a Syrian engineer trained in France by the nom de guerre of Abu Mus'ab al-Suri, posts on the internet his Global Islamic Resistance Call, 1,600-page essay in Arabic, that draws the lessons of the failures of the preceding two phases. If you wish, in this sort of Hegelian dialectics of jihadism, this is the Aufhebung, the third phase, I don't know how to say that in English, dépassement, Aufhebung. And he says, okay, nearby enemy, who cares? No one gives a damn if Muslims kill Muslims. Look at what happens in Yemen today, for instance, as a confirmation. Faraway enemy, America is too far away, too mighty, too far away. And, didn't make the link with the grassroots. What we have to do is to change the locus and the modus operandi. The locus, Europe, instead of America. Europe as the soft underbelly of the West. A place which is near to the Middle East and North Africa, where you can go with a chartered flight less for 50 quids from Britain, probably. Or you can even drive a car. And take a chartered bus. So nothing to do with America, which is far away. And also, so you can go and get there and train, come back, get brainwashed. And also, the fact that there are millions of disenfranchised young Muslims in the West, children of immigrants, who he foresaw as would-be soldiers of the Islamic State. And this was what he had in mind at the time. And in terms of modus operandi, as opposed to the top-down or Leninist, if you wish, model of bin Laden, who trained everyone in advance, the 9/11 people were trained just like Secret Service agents, if you want. He considered that the issue was to have a bottom-up phenomenon. Bottom-up and network-based, i.e. that people would be sort of entrusted with this jihadist ideology, but it would be led to the local agents or to the local people, the Manchester, the Tremblay en France, the Montauban or the Berlin people, to implement the action and to choose the targets, if possible, in their neighborhood. The multiplication of those actions would provoke the majority population to overreact, to desacralize mosques, to humiliate Muslims in public, to vote for the extreme right in huge numbers. And that would feed the narrative of the jihadists, who would say, see, they don't want us. There is no future in mixing with European populations. You have to live on your own. You have to cling back to your ascribed identity as a staunch Sharia-abiding people in this sort of Salafi interpretation of the Sharia. Salafists and jihadists share the same ideological tenets. In Arabic, it's called al-wala wal-bara'a, which means allegiance, wala, to the Salafi scholars' worldview, a sort of very strict and rigorous understanding of Islam, which considers that whoever is not a Salafist is a bad Muslim and an apostate whose blood is licit, it is licit to shed, and that the rest of the world is made out of kuffar or infidels who deserve the same fate. Now this is something which was phrased also in Suri's language as, in Arabic, nizam la tanzim, a system, not an organization. Okay? No one took him seriously at the time, and I told our friends here that I remember a talk in 2007 at the Foreign Office on the other side of the street when a guy told me, you know, it does not work. It does not work because a terrorism network has to be pyramidal. It cannot work. But they just missed what would be the essence of the modern age, i.e. the digital revolution, which allowed for a network-based system to function. And this, coincidentally, you know, Suri's book, Suri was an engineer trained in France, but then partially, then married a Spanish woman, and then lived most of his European life in London, which at the time we facetiously called Londonistan from the other side of the channel, because this is where you had gathered all the leaders of Islamist groups worldwide. And he acted out of Finsbury Park Mosque. And Suri's view was that you could proselytize from the bottom up, right? And this was implemented incrementally. At first, this was something that took shape in the prisons of Europe, mainly in France, where you had so many Muslim prisoners. Not that Muslim leads to crime, but they are poor and disenfranchised, and poor disenfranchised people usually go to jail. Or the ones who are in jail are poor and disenfranchised. Let's put it the other way around. The proselytizing meant that jihadists in jail would tell the petty criminals, if you're in jail, it's not because of you. It's because society is Islamophobe, is xenophobe, and the only way for you to be redeemed is to put your violence in this for the sake of jihad, use it for the sake of jihad. And they were role models in the jails, if you wish, and that worked very well, and most of the ones who perpetrated the bloodiest attacks in Paris had done a lot of time in jail. When then, after they did their time, went to the caliphate, so-called caliphate territory, came back, and the Bataclan affair epitomized that, you know. Now, this model, as we said, had assets because you could go under the radar of the intelligence agencies, and you would reach out to the grassroots people, but also its liabilities. The liabilities were that those people are not very well trained, and it's a matter of chance more than planning if they succeed. Look at the Bataclan issue, for instance. They had luck from their point of view. You know, they saw this concert, they machine gun people, they killed a lot of people. There was also another side to the Bataclan attack, the Stade de France attack. And this would have been far more bloody had it succeeded, because there were 80,000 people in the stadium with François Hollande, our then president, and Franz Steinmeier, who's now the president of the Bundesrepublik of Germany, who was at the time the MOFA. They went with their explosive jackets to the stadium, 3 of them, but they just forgot to buy the tickets to get into the stadium. Something that would never have happened in bin Laden's days, right? And they waited outside, thinking that, you know, when the crowd came out, like what happened in Manchester, it would be easier. But the problem was that the TATP, the explosive in the jacket, was not very well fixed, right? And the guys were sort of nervous, which is unbelievable, and they started to sweat like crazy, and the body temperature raised. And when the body temperature rises, and then this explosive detonates. And so they detonated by themselves without doing anything to them because of the sweating, because of the anxiety. It's an interesting story because it shows you, you know, the assets and the liabilities of the model. In bin Laden days, this would never have happened, right? Now, this was only a sort of a paradigmatic anecdote, but this is probably what led to the fact that in the French circumstances, with this heavy security we have now, the state of emergency, which has been prolonged yesterday because of Manchester until November 1st, the liabilities dimension is getting bigger in the French context. And a number of those people took on their own to, you know, maybe overstretch. And like Rashid Qassem, the guy who had sentenced me to death 3 times and who's been drawn by an American drone in February, in the meanwhile, in September last year, took on him to launch these female commando attacks, which were very, very badly prepared, and which led to the fact that everybody was arrested, that the French cops got the phones, arrested preemptively everybody, probably broke into the software. And we had no attack over the last 8 months, which, as I said in the beginning, was so important for the outcome of the French presidential election. And look now what you have in Manchester, when, you know, the jihadists want to interfere with the political process in the West. And because of Manchester, the campaign for the parliamentary elections in Britain was suspended, temporarily, of course, but nevertheless, this, for them, is a big success, right? Now, so to cut a long story short, what I wanted to do with this book, and particularly in its foreign translation, was to try to suggest that we have a model of understanding of this phenomenon. It's not out of the blue. This is something that you could put in perspective, and that the quality of the diagnosis is of essence. And when people ask me, what do you think for the future, what should be implemented, it's not that I shun my responsibilities, but I believe as an academic, I believe what I can do, my contribution is to make the soundest possible diagnosis. And the reason why we did not succeed was that we were bad on the diagnosis until then. When the diagnosis is sound, then the therapy can be implemented. And with this optimistic view, I will end here, and thank you for a very kind hosting of this event. And of course, I'm at your disposal to take your remarks and questions. Thanks a lot.